The new doctors mocked the quiet night nurse for charting by hand and carrying an antique brass penlight, and not one of them knew that the gray-haired woman they called Slow had once run resuscitations in the back of a screaming medevac helicopter, and that before the night was over, she would be the only person on that floor who could keep a young man's heart beating. Her name was Eleanor Voss, and most of the staff called her Nell, and the new residents, the ones who had arrived in July with their fresh badges and their certainty, did not call her anything at all because to them she was part of the furniture, a fixture of the night shift like the hum of the ice machine or the soft chime of the call lights. She was 58 years old. She had been a nurse for 36 of those years, the last 9 of them on this cardiac step-down floor, working nights by choice, because nights were quieter and the work was hers, and nobody up the chain had the energy at 3 in the morning to tell her how to do a job she had been doing since before they were born. She moved through the ward the way deep water moves, slow and certain and easy to underestimate. And on the night everything changed, she was exactly where she always was at the start of a shift, at the long nurse's station under the bright ceiling lights, clipping a worn brass penlight to the lanyard at her chest before she walked the floor. The penlight was old. The brass had gone soft and dull at the edges from decades of thumbs, and clipped beside it on the same cord was a small pair of faded metal wings, the kind a person earns and does not buy, though none of the residents had ever looked closely enough to wonder what they were. She checked it the way some people check a wedding ring when they are bracing for a long day, a small private touch, and then she snapped it on and squared her shoulders and went to see her patients. Dr. Aidan Crail was 31 years old and had been the senior resident on the night service for exactly 3 weeks, and he had already decided that Eleanor Voss was a problem. Not a dangerous problem, a small one, an efficiency problem. He had watched her write her assessments out longhand in the paper backup chart, even after she entered them in the computer, and he had watched her stand in a doorway for a full 30 seconds, just looking at a sleeping patient before she touched a single thing, and he had watched her decline, twice, to wake an attending over the phone for an order he thought was obvious, and he had filed all of it under the same heading, which was old, behind the times, slow. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He was something more ordinary, a young man who had finished near the top of every class he had ever taken and had come to believe that the top of the class was the same thing as the front of the room, and that the people who had not gone to the schools he had gone to were, by simple arithmetic, behind him. He looked at a 58-year-old woman writing in cursive under a fluorescent light, and he saw a person the system had passed by, and he felt, God help him, a little sorry for her, in the easy, weightless way you feel sorry for someone you have never once imagined being. You know the rooms have lights built into the wall, he said to her that first week, nodding at the pen light on her chest with a smile that was almost kind, the kind of smile you give a child showing you a drawing. You don't have to carry an antique around. And Eleanor had looked down at the small brass thing on her lanyard and then back up at him, and she had said, I know, and nothing else, and gone back to her chart, and he had taken her silence for the surrender of a woman who had no answer, when in fact it was the silence of a woman who had a great many answers and had simply learned, across 36 years, that the people who needed to tell her she was obsolete were rarely the people who would listen if she told them why she was not. So she let it stand. She let almost all of it stand. That was the thing about Eleanor Voss that none of them understood, and that the night would teach them all at once. She did not need them to see her. She needed her patients alive by morning, and she needed her hands steady, and she needed the penlight on her chest, though she could not always have told you why she still carried it after all these years, only that the night she stopped would be the night she would need it. There were 2 of them who followed Crail's lead, the way younger residents always follow the senior, a clean-cut young man named Bryce, and a sharp, quick young woman named Priya, both of them 28, both of them brilliant on paper, both of them good people who had simply been taught by the whole shape of their training to trust the screen over the person and the protocol over the gray-haired woman who could not quote them the year a guideline had changed. They were not bad. That is the part that matters, the part the story keeps coming back to, that the people who dismissed Eleanor Voss were not villains, they were just wrong, and they were wrong in the specific way that smart, confident people are wrong, which is the hardest kind of wrong to fix, because it does not feel like wrongness from the inside. It feels like competence. It feels like being right. And on most nights, on an ordinary cardiac floor where the patients were stable and the problems were the problems that come out of a textbook, their kind of wrong cost nothing at all. The floor ran. The monitors beeped their steady green beeps. The old nurse checked her patients and was easy to ignore, and everyone was comfortable inside the arrangement, and nobody, not one of them, was watching the young man in room 4. His name was Daniel Okafor, and he was 26 years old, a graduate student who had come in 3 days earlier with a fever and a chest that hurt when he breathed, and he had been worked up and treated and labeled, the way every patient gets labeled, with a tidy diagnosis that explained most of what was wrong with him, and, as it turned out, not the thing that was going to nearly kill him. He was, on the board at the nurse's station, a low acuity patient, a young heart, a body that by every actuarial table in the building should bounce back from almost anything, and that was exactly why the residents were not worried about him, because the young and the strong are supposed to be the safe ones, and a busy night service triages its worry toward the frail and the old. But Eleanor had stood in his doorway that evening for her full 30 seconds, just looking, the way she always did, and something at the back of her skull, some old animal that had been awake in worse rooms than this one, had turned its head toward the young man in the bed and gone very still for a moment, and she had not had a word for it. Not yet. She had only made a small mark in her own paper chart, a single line the computer had no field for. Watch this one. She did not know why. Her hands knew before her mind did. They always had. That was the thing about her that no metric in that building could measure, and that Aidan Crail, with all his certainty, could not have begun to imagine that she noticed things, that she had spent a whole life noticing the one body in the room that was about to go wrong, and being right, and being thanked for it by people who forgot her name by morning. So she put a line in her chart, and she kept it in the back of her mind through the first hours of the shift, the way you keep a hand near a rail, and she went on with the ordinary work, the medications and the dressing changes and the slow patient rounds, and the residents went on with theirs, and the bright, clean floor hummed along under its even lights and out past the tall windows. At the end of the hall, the city went dark and then deep dark, and then began, very faintly, to think about dawn. And somewhere in the quiet machinery of Daniel Alcifer's young chest, in the narrow sac of fluid that holds the heart, something that the tidy diagnosis had not accounted for was slowly, silently beginning to fill. If you have ever watched someone good get treated like they were nothing and felt that quiet anger that has nowhere to go, then you already understand why I tell these stories, and you already belong on this channel. Take 1 second to subscribe, because Unspoken Valor exists for exactly that feeling and exactly these people, the ones the room writes off, the ones who turn out to be the only thing holding the room up. The folks who do are the ones who stay for the part where the world finally finds out who it has been ignoring, and that part is coming, and I do not want you to miss it, because what happened on that floor before the sun came up is the kind of thing that, if you had seen it, you would never have looked at a quiet night nurse the same way again. There was one person on that floor who already knew, or who at least suspected, the way you suspect weather before it turns. Her name was Marisol Reyes, and she was 44, and she had worked nights beside Eleanor for 6 years, and she had the thing you cannot teach, which is the ability to read a person across a room. Marisol had never been told Eleanor's history. Eleanor did not tell people her history. But Marisol had worked beside her through 100 bad nights, the codes and the crashes and the long, slow deaths, and she had seen the way the older woman moved when everything came apart, the way the panic that took everyone else simply did not seem to reach her, the way her voice dropped lower and got clearer instead of higher and faster. And Marisol had drawn the only conclusion a smart person could draw, which was that wherever Eleanor Voss had learned to be a nurse, it had not been a place like this. A new hire had asked her once in the break room why the residents got away with talking down to the old lady, why Nell never pushed back, and Marisol had looked up from her phone and said, simple as weather, because that woman has forgotten more than those kids will ever learn, and she carries it so quiet you'd never know. Leave her be. The new hire had not understood. Almost nobody did. They would, though. By the time the sun came up, every soul on that floor would understand exactly what Marisol meant, and some of them would spend the rest of their careers trying to be a little more like the woman they had spent 3 months overlooking. Here is what they did not know about the quiet night nurse. 36 years before that night, when she was barely out of her training, Eleanor Voss had put on a uniform of a very different color and learned a trade that the residents on that floor could not have imagined existed. She had been a flight nurse, not the version in the recruitment posters, with the music swelling and the perfect hair. The real version, the one with the noise and the altitude and the math, the brutal arithmetic of keeping a torn open human being alive in the back of a helicopter that was bouncing through the dark with no surgeon and no operating room and no time, where you learn in your first month that the most important skill you will ever have is not any single procedure, but the cold, fast triage of attention itself. The ability to decide in seconds, with the cabin shaking and the alarm screaming and a life draining out onto the floor of the aircraft, which problem will kill this person first and which can wait. She had flown critical care evacuation for a fictional aeromedical unit whose call sign she had not spoken aloud in 20 years. She had a tattoo on the inside of her left forearm, faded now to the color of an old bruise, that told you which unit if you knew how to read it, and a thin, pale scar above it from a night she did not talk about. She had run resuscitations at 300 feet with her knees braced against a litter. She had taught younger nurses and medics how to find a problem with their hands when the machines were useless or lying, because at altitude, in the noise, with the vibrations shaking every sensor, the machines were very often both. And she had learned the lesson that sat underneath everything else she ever did, the one she would say to herself the night Daniel Okafor's heart stopped, the way you say a prayer you no longer fully believe but cannot stop reaching for. The monitor is not the patient. The number on the screen is not the patient. The patient is the patient, and you find the truth with your eyes and your hands, and the day you forget, that is the day the screen kills somebody for you. She had carried a brass penlight in that aircraft, a cheap, simple thing she had bought in a shop near the base her first week, and she had used it 10,000 times in the dark to check the one thing a monitor can never tell you, which is what is happening behind a person's eyes, and it had become, without her ever deciding it, the most reliable instrument she owned, because it never needed a battery she did not have, and never lost its signal, and never, not once, told her a comfortable lie. The wings clipped beside it she had been given on a day she did not talk about either. And when she came home from all of it, the way her whole quiet generation of people in that work came home, which is to say without a parade, into a country that found it easier not to ask, she had folded the other life away and become a civilian nurse, floors and units, and a long stretch in emergency rooms where the younger doctors slowly, every single time, figured out that the calm older woman in the corner was the person you wanted in the room when everything went wrong at once. She had kept the penlight. She had clipped it to every lanyard she had worn for 36 years. She had never explained it. And on the nights when a new resident smiled at it and called it an antique, she let them, because she had learned that the people who need to tell you that you are obsolete are usually telling you something about their own fear, and because the work was honest and the patients were real, and because somewhere under all of it she was tired, bone tired, the particular tiredness of a person who has carried other people her whole life and would have liked just once to be allowed to be ordinary. The years after the uniform had not been gentle either, in the quiet ways that years are not gentle. There had been a marriage, a good one, to a steady man who had understood without being told that there were rooms in her she did not open, and there had been the long, slow work of an ordinary life laid down over the top of the other thing. And then there had been his illness, the expensive kind, the kind that eats a lifetime of careful saving in a year and a half. And after he was gone, there had been the bills that do not care that you spent your life caring for other people. Her body had started filing its own complaints by then, the knees, the shoulder that ached where the scar was when the weather turned, and the easy money in nursing was in the daytime management job she did not want, and the travel contracts her life could no longer bend around. And so she had settled into nights on a step-down floor at the kind of steady, modest wage that keeps the lights on and not much more, and she had been glad of it because the work was still the work, and a patient at 2 a.m. does not care how old your shoes are. So at 58, a woman who had once decided who lived and who could wait, while an aircraft pitched through the dark was writing her assessments in cursive under a fluorescent light, and a 31-year-old man who had never in his life had to make a 4-second decision that truly mattered, looked at her pace and decided she was finished, and she let him, because she had learned a long time ago that you do not get to choose what people make of you. You only get to choose what you make of the next necessary thing in front of your hands. But you do not get to choose the night either. That was the other thing she knew, that they did not. You do not get to decide that tonight you are only a tired old woman writing in a chart. The night decides. And on this one, while Aidan Crail sat at the far computer feeling quietly competent, and Bryce and Priya argued in low voices about a guideline neither of them had read all the way through, and the floor hummed and the call lights chimed and the city outside thought about dawn, the slow, silent filling in the sack around Daniel Okafor's heart crossed at last the line between something his young body could compensate for and something it could not. It happens like that. There is a threshold, invisible, and a person can sit just below it looking almost fine, their strong heart squeezing harder and harder against a tightening grip, holding the line, holding it until the moment the line breaks, and then there is no slow slide. There is a cliff. Daniel Okafor reached his cliff at 4:40 in the morning, and the first sign of it was not an alarm and not a scream. It was a young man in room 4 pressing his call light and saying in a voice that was suddenly, strangely calm, that he felt like something was sitting on his chest, and that he was very thirsty, and that he thought he might be about to pass out. Eleanor was in the room in under a minute, and she did the thing she always did, which was to look before she touched. She stood at the foot of the bed for 2 seconds, no more, and she read him the way she had read 1,000 crashing patients in worse light than this, and what she saw made the old animal at the back of her skull come fully awake. He was pale, and his skin had a faint sheen of sweat, and his breathing was quick and shallow, and he was sitting up, leaning forward, and his eyes had the particular bright, glassy fear of a body that has begun to understand at some level below, thought that it is in trouble. She put 2 fingers to his wrist, and the pulse there was fast and thin and oddly hard to find, faint at the edge of him, the way a pulse goes when the heart is beating but somehow not getting its work out into the body, and she looked at his neck, and the veins there were standing up, full, distended, when a young man sitting upright should have flat, soft veins at his throat, and that one detail, the full neck veins on an upright patient with a thready pulse, landed in her like a key turning in a lock she had not opened in 20 years. She did not let it show on her face. She never did. But somewhere in the part of her that kept the field map, a small cold certainty had already begun to form, and it had a shape, and the shape was bad. "Daniel, I'm right here," she said, and her voice was low and easy, the voice you use to keep a frightened person from following their body over the edge. "You're going to keep looking at me, and you're going to breathe with me. Slow, that's it." And while she said it, her hands were already moving, getting the monitor leads on him properly, getting a blood pressure cuff on his arm, and she reached up and pressed the call button and asked the unit clerk, in the same easy voice, to please have the night team come to room 4 now and to bring the cart. Not panic, a handhold. She had learned a long time ago that the words you say in the first 30 seconds of a crisis are the most important words you will say, because a calm, clear voice in a frightening room is the most powerful instrument there is, more powerful than any drug on the cart, and she spent those first words building a floor under a terrified young man so he would not fall through. The blood pressure cuff cycled, and the number it gave her was low, far too low, and when she cycled it again it was lower, and his pulse on the monitor was climbing and his oxygen was beginning to slide, and by the time Aiden Crail walked into the room with Bryce a step behind him, Eleanor already knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had seen this exact thing before, that they were not looking at the problem the chart said they should be looking at. She knew it the way you know a face, and she made a decision in that instant that she would turn over in her mind many times in the weeks that followed. The decision to say it plainly, right away, to a young doctor who did not respect her because the patient did not have time for her to be tactful. "His pressure's dropping and his neck veins are up," she said, even and clear, the moment Crail was through the door. "Pulse is thready, heart sounds are muffled. I think this is his heart being squeezed from the outside, not a problem inside it. I think it's the sac filling." It is hard to overstate how much that one sentence cost her, and how much it should have been worth, and how completely it was wasted. Because what Eleanor Voss had just done, in plain words, was hand Aiden Crail the answer. She had laid out, in the order they teach you to look for it, the classic signs of the very thing that was killing the young man in the bed: a heart being slowly strangled by fluid filling the rigid sac around it, the pressure building until the chambers could no longer fill, and the strong young heart was squeezing against a closing fist and pushing nothing out. She had named it, and Aiden Crail, 31 years old, 3 weeks into running the night service, heard the diagnosis from the mouth of the gray-haired night nurse he had decided was obsolete. And he did the thing that certainty does, the thing that is so human and so dangerous, which is that he did not hear the words, he heard who was saying them. He glanced at the monitor where the heart rhythm was an organized, fast, regular pattern, a normal-looking electrical tracing, and he saw a number on a screen that did not say emergency to him in the language he had been trained to read, and he looked at Eleanor with that almost kind, almost sorry expression, and he said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse, "Okay, let's not get ahead of ourselves. The rhythm's fine. He's young, his pressure's probably just soft from the fever and being dry. Let's give him some fluids and recheck. Nell, can you hang a liter wide open?" And there it was. Fluids. The exact wrong thing. Because if a heart is being crushed from the outside by a filling sac, pouring more fluid into the body does almost nothing to help, and the real fix is somewhere else entirely. And worse, it costs you the one commodity you cannot get back, which is time. Eleanor felt the old fury rise in her, the specific fury of knowing, of being certain, and being waved off by someone with the authority to be wrong, and she did the hardest thing her whole life had taught her to do, which was to keep her voice level. "I'll hang it," she said, because she would not refuse a young man a liter of fluid that would not hurt him in the next 2 minutes. "But, doctor, I've seen this before, more than once, and I am telling you his heart is being squeezed. Fluids won't fix it. He needs an ultrasound on that chest, and he needs it now, and if I'm right, he needs someone to take the pressure off that sac, please. Page cardiology and get the ultrasound in here." And Crail, who had a floor full of patients and a long night ahead and a firm young belief that the nurses who had been around too long all thought every fever was a catastrophe, said the sentence that he would hear in his own head for the rest of his career, the sentence that would wake him up at night for years. He said, "I appreciate the input, Nell, I do, but I've got this. Let's stay in our lanes. Hang the fluids and let me run the resuscitation if it comes to that, all right? Stay in our lanes." He even smiled when he said it. And Bryce, beside him, did not laugh exactly, but something passed over his young face, the faint reflexive amusement of the junior agreeing with the senior, and Eleanor saw it, and she filed it, and she turned and hung the liter of fluid wide open, because the patient came first, and her pride came nowhere at all, and she stayed in the room. If you've made it this far into Eleanor's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you, because up to now you have seen a competent woman tell the truth and be ignored, and that is something, but it is not yet the thing. The thing is what happens in the next 4 minutes when the young man's strong heart finally loses its fight against the closing fist and the monitor does something that makes no sense, and 3 brilliant young doctors run the textbook code perfectly and watch it fail, and the only person in the room who understands why is the one they just told to stay in her lane. There is no way you walk away from this story once you have seen what she does. The fluids ran in, and for about 90 seconds the young man seemed, if anything, slightly better, his pressure ticking up a few points, and Eleanor watched Aidan Crail's shoulders ease a fraction, watched him take the small improvement as proof that he had been right, and she wanted to tell him that a heart being squeezed will sometimes take a breath of relief from a little extra volume right before it loses the fight entirely, that the small improvement was not a victory, it was the deep breath before the cliff. But she had already said it twice and been told to stay in her lane, and so she did the only useful thing left to her, which was to position herself quietly on the far side of the bed, with the crash cart within arm's reach and her own 2 hands free, and to wait, the way she had waited in the back of an aircraft for a patient she knew was going to crash, coiled and calm so that when the moment came, she would already be where she needed to be. And the moment came. At 4:51 in the morning, Daniel Okafor's eyes rolled up and he slumped back against the pillows, and the alarm on the monitor went from its steady tone to the high urgent shriek of a patient in trouble, and the bright clean room tipped all at once into a code. "He's out, he's not responsive," Bryce said, his voice climbing, and Crail moved fast. To his credit, he moved fast, hand to the carotid, and his face changed, because there was no pulse under his fingers, none, and he said the word that turns a room into a machine. He said, "Code blue, call it, he's coding." And the unit clerk hit the alarm, and overhead a calm recorded voice began to call the code to the building, and Priya came through the door at a run, and within 90 seconds the room was full, the night code team assembling around the bed and the choreography they had all drilled, and the first thing they did, the correct thing, the thing the protocol commands, was to start chest compressions and look at the rhythm on the screen. And this is where the night turned strange, where it became the kind of code that the people in that room would talk about in low voices for years, because when they stopped compressions for 2 seconds to read the monitor, the rhythm was not the chaos you expect in a dying heart. It was not the wild quiver of fibrillation that you shock. It was an organized rhythm, a clean, regular electrical pattern marching across the screen at a normal speed, the tracing of a heart that by every appearance on that monitor was beating perfectly well, and there was no pulse beneath it, none. A heart that looked, electrically, completely normal, and a body with no circulation at all. There is a name for that, and every one of the doctors in the room knew it cold from their exams, an organized rhythm on the monitor with no pulse in the patient, the electrical signal firing into a heart that is not pumping, and the protocol for it is precise, and they ran it precisely. They could not shock it, because there is nothing to shock. The electricity is already organized, and so they did the other thing the algorithm says. They pushed hard, fast compressions, and they gave the drug that the protocol calls for, and they waited the 2 minutes and they checked again, and the rhythm was still there, clean and organized and meaningless, and still there was no pulse, and they pushed the drug again and compressed again and checked again, around and around the cycle the textbook draws, doing everything right, everything by the book, and the young man on the bed did not come back because the book they were following has a hidden assumption baked into it, an assumption so deep that you can run the whole algorithm a dozen times without ever noticing it is there, and the assumption is this, that the reason the heart is not pumping is somewhere inside the heart, a problem of the muscle or the electrics, fixable with drugs and time and pressure on the chest, and Daniel Okafor's heart was perfectly fine. His heart was a healthy 26-year-old heart, and there was nothing wrong with the muscle and nothing wrong with the electrics, and that was exactly why the monitor showed a normal rhythm. The problem was not in the heart. The problem was around it. The sac had filled until the heart could not expand to fill with blood, and so it was beating, faithfully, electrically perfect, against a fist that would not let it open, and you could compress that chest until dawn and push that drug until the cart was empty and it would do nothing. Nothing at all, because none of it addressed the fist, and the only thing on this earth that would save him was to take the pressure off the sac, and not one of the 3 brilliant young people running that code was looking outside the heart, because everything they trusted, the monitor, the protocol, the rhythm on the screen, was telling them the heart was the place to look. Eleanor watched them run it. She watched them do everything right, and she watched it fail, the way she had known it would fail the moment she saw those neck veins, and the hardest part, the part that pressed on her chest like a stone, was that they were good. They were genuinely good. Their compressions were strong, and their timing was clean, and their drugs were correct, and it was all going to be useless, every perfect motion of it, because they were answering a question the patient was not asking. She gave them one cycle. She made herself give them one full cycle, because she had learned long ago that there is a moment to speak and a moment that is too early, and a senior resident running a code does not hear a contradiction. In the first 30 seconds, his whole mind is locked onto the algorithm. But when the second rhythm check showed the same clean, organized line and the same dead pulse, and she saw Aidan Crail's face beginning to do the things she had seen on so many young faces over the years, the first crack of the terrible understanding that he was doing everything correctly and the patient was dying anyway, and he did not know why. She knew the moment had come, and she stepped forward to the side of the bed, and she said it again, louder this time, clear enough to cut through the noise of the room the way her voice had once cut through the noise of an aircraft. Doctor, the rhythm is organized and there's no pulse. That is not a heart problem. His heart is fine, that's why the rhythm looks normal. Something is stopping it from filling. It is the sac, or it is his chest, and you need to find out which in the next 2 minutes, or we are going to lose him, and no drug in that cart is going to change it." For one heartbeat, Aidan Crail looked at her, and Eleanor watched the war happen behind his eyes, the collision between 3 weeks of being the man in charge and the cold fact of a young man dying under his hands for a reason he could not name, and she watched with a strange detached compassion as the certainty in him cracked all the way through. Because that is what a code like this does. It strips everything away that is not true and leaves you standing in the noise with nothing but the patient and your own helplessness. And in that stripped place, Aidan Crail, to his lasting credit, did the bravest thing a proud young person can do. He let go of being right. He looked at the gray-haired night nurse he had told to stay in her lane, and he heard this time not who was speaking, but what she was saying, and he said in a voice that had lost all of its smoothness, a voice that was suddenly very young, "Then tell me what to do." And Eleanor Voss stopped being a tired old woman who charted in cursive and became the most dangerous thing in that room, which was a calm person who knew exactly what to do. She did not waste a breath on triumph. There was no triumph in her. There was only the patient and the clock, and she moved to the head of the bed and took command of the code the way she had taken command of 100 crashing patients in the dark, not by shouting, but by becoming the still point everyone else could orient to. "Keep compressing, hard and fast, do not stop except when I say," she said to Bryce, and he obeyed because a clear voice in a nightmare pulls you like gravity. "Priya, I need you to get the ultrasound, the portable one. It's in the equipment alcove by the supply room, the gray machine. Go now and bring it and turn it on as you come." Priya went. And then Eleanor reached up to the lanyard at her chest and unclipped the worn brass penlight, the antique, the thing Aidan Crail had smiled at, and she leaned over the young man and thumbed it on, and she lifted his eyelid and shone the small old light into his eye, and what she read there told her something. The monitor screaming 3 feet away could not tell anyone, which was the state of the brain behind the eye, the perfusion, how much time was truly left, and it was little, it was so little. And she said, flat and fast to the part of herself that kept the records, pupil sluggish, "We have minutes." And then she put 2 fingers against the side of the young man's neck during a pause in compressions, feeling for the truth with her hands the way the aircraft had taught her when the sensors lied, and she felt the absence of a pulse, and she looked at his neck veins standing full and proud on a man lying flat and dying, and the last piece clicked into place, and she was certain, all the way down, with the certainty that had kept her alive and kept her patients alive for 36 years. "Listen to me, all of you, and do exactly what I say in the order I say it." Her voice filled the room, and the room bent toward it. The code team and the residents and the respiratory therapist, every one of them turning, without deciding to, toward the one person who was not afraid. This is his heart being crushed from the outside, fluid in the sac around it, building up, squeezing it shut. The reason the rhythm looks normal is that the heart itself is healthy. It's trying to beat, it just can't fill against the pressure. Compressions buy us a little time, and that is all they buy us. The only thing that saves him is taking that pressure off the sac, and we are going to do it. And Dr. Crail, you are going to do it because you have the hands, and I am going to walk you through every second of it. And Aidan Crail, who 20 minutes ago had been the most confident man on the floor, stared at her, and he said, I've only seen it in a sim, I've never actually. And Eleanor cut him off, not harshly, the way you cut off a frightened person to hand them something solid to hold. "I know, I have, more times than I can count. I cannot do the puncture, it is not my license, but I can put your hands exactly where they need to go and tell you exactly what to feel for. And between the 2 of us, we are going to get this. You are not alone in this. Look at me. You are not alone. Now where is that ultrasound?" Priya came back through the door, pushing the gray machine, and Eleanor had it positioned and the probe in Priya's hands and a gob of gel on the young man's chest before the screen had even fully woken, and when the image came up, grainy and gray and shifting, Eleanor read it in half a second, the way you read a face, and there it was for all of them to see. The heart on the screen, a healthy heart, beating, and around it a black stripe of fluid where there should have been almost nothing, a thick band of it pressing in on all sides, the chambers collapsing inward with every beat instead of opening to fill, the picture of a strong heart strangling in its own sac, and a small sound went through the room, the sound of three young doctors seeing, with their own eyes on a screen they trusted, the thing the gray-haired nurse had named out loud 5 full minutes before any of them would listen. Aidan Crail looked at the black stripe of fluid and then at Eleanor, and the last of his disbelief drained out of his face and left behind it something raw and absolutely focused. And he said, "Tell me where." She told him where. She had the long needle and the syringe ready from the cart. She had prepped the skin, and she guided his hand to the spot below the breastbone, the old approach, the one you can do in the field with nothing but your hands and your nerve, and she told him the angle, aim for the left shoulder, flat, go slow, and she told him to pull back on the plunger the whole way in so he would know the instant he was in the fluid, and she kept the ultrasound probe steady with her own hand so he could see the needle on the screen as it went. Her voice low and continuous and absolutely steady. "You're doing fine, a little flatter. Keep coming. Watch the tip on the screen. Keep pulling back," and the whole room held its breath. Compressions paused, the monitor screaming its meaningless perfect rhythm, and Aidan Crail's hand shook, and Eleanor put her own hand over his for 1 second, just one, and steadied it and said, "Slow, I've got you. Now," and the needle slid the last half centimeter and the syringe filled suddenly with blood, dark and fast, the fluid that had been crushing the heart releasing up the needle into the barrel, and Eleanor said, "That's it. That's it. Hold it right there. Don't move. Let it come." And she drew off the syringe, and there was more, and she emptied it and drew again, and somewhere around the third draw, as the pressure came off the strangled heart, and the chambers were suddenly free to open and fill and squeeze the way they had been trying to squeeze the whole time. A pulse came back under Priya's fingers at the young man's wrist, thin at first and then stronger, real, alive, and the rhythm on the monitor, the same organized rhythm that had meant nothing for 10 endless minutes, suddenly meant everything, because now there was a pulse beneath it, and Daniel Alcafer, 26 years old, dead by every measure 2 minutes earlier, drew a ragged breath of his own. It was in the middle of that, in the held silence as the pulse climbed and steadied, that Marisol Reyes, who had come in with the code team and had been pushing drugs and watching everything, saw it. Eleanor had reached across the bed to steady the ultrasound, and the sleeve of her teal scrubs had dragged back from her left forearm, and there, in the hard, bright overhead light, it showed the thing she always kept covered, the faded tattoo on the inside of her arm, dulled to the color of an old bruise, a unit and a set of numbers, and above it the thin white line of the scar, and Marisol's eyes went from the tattoo to those calm, certain hands doing the impossible thing they had just done, and back to the tattoo, and her face changed. And it was Aidan Crail, of all people, still half bent over the patient with the syringe in his hand, who said the thing out loud, because he had seen the tattoo too, and he was looking at this woman who had just walked him through a procedure he had only ever done on a mannequin, who had read a dying patient with a $50 penlight and her own 2 fingers, while every machine in the room lied, and the question came out of him in a kind of awe, stripped of every ounce of the condescension he had carried for 3 weeks. "Who are you?" he said. "Where did you learn that?" And Eleanor Voss, who never explained herself, who had let them call her slow and obsolete and an antique for 3 months and not corrected a single one of them, did not look up from her patient. She just gave the answer her hands had already given, flat and quiet, the way she had given it across a litter at 300 feet. Somewhere they didn't have the machines. You learn to use your eyes when the machines aren't coming. And she clipped the penlight back onto her lanyard, and she said, "Now let's get him stable. We are not done." And they were not done, because a heart that has been crushed and suddenly freed is a fragile thing, and the fluid in the sac would keep coming until someone fixed the source of it, and the next stretch of that night was its own long siege, the kind Eleanor knew in her bones, the work of holding a patient on the right side of a line that wants to slip. She did not let the room relax. She had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous moment in a resuscitation is the one right after the save, when relief floods in and attention drops and everyone wants to believe the worst is over. And she kept them all working, kept Bryce on the pulse and Priya on the pressures and Crail watching the ultrasound, kept drawing off small amounts of fluid as it reaccumulated, buying minutes, always buying minutes, because the real fix for the young man was upstairs in a room with a surgeon and proper equipment, and that was where he needed to go, fast, and she was already directing it, telling the clerk to get cardiology and the operating room moving, telling them what to say so the people on the other end of the phone would understand in 3 seconds how close this was. And the team moved around her now in a different way than they had an hour before. They moved the way a team moves around someone it trusts, no longer arguing, no longer waving her off, just doing, fast and clean, the orders flowing out of her and the work flowing back. And the strange thing, the thing that told you everything about who she was, is that Eleanor did not notice the change because she was not watching them watch her. She was watching her patient. She was still counting. She would be counting in her sleep that night and for many nights after. But the night had one more turn in it, because the nights always do, and it came from the place a good clinician learns to fear most, which is the second problem hiding behind the first. They had the young man nearly ready to move when his oxygen, which had come up beautifully once the heart was freed, began, quietly, to slide again, and his breathing began to labor in a new way, and a lesser team, a team running on the relief of the first save, might have missed it for a critical minute or two, but Eleanor caught it in the first 10 seconds because she had never stopped watching, and she put her stethoscope on his chest and listened, and her face went still in the particular way it went still when she found a new bad thing, and she said, "His right lung? I'm not hearing air move on the right." And she put her hands on his chest, both of them, feeling, comparing the two sides, and she felt the right side of his chest sitting fuller and tighter than the left, and she watched the way his windpipe at the base of his throat was beginning, just beginning, to pull a fraction toward the left, away from the bad side, and she knew, with the same cold certainty as before, that the trauma of the resuscitation, the compressions, the needle, the strain of it all had brought on a second killer, air leaking into the space around the lung and building up with nowhere to go, pressing the lung flat and beginning to shove the heart itself across the chest. And this one she had also seen too many times in the back of the aircraft, where it is one of the things that kills fast and silently and is missed by people watching screens. And this one, too, had a fix that was old and crude and did not wait for a surgeon. "He's got air trapped on the right. It's tensioning. It's going to crush everything all over again if we don't release it," she said. And Aidan Crail, who an hour ago would have argued, did not argue. He said, "What do we do?" And she told him, and once again she put his hands where they needed to go, the second space between the ribs, just so, and once again she talked him through it, steady and continuous, and the needle went in and there was a hiss, a long, soft hiss of trapped air escaping. the most beautiful sound in the world, and the young man's chest eased and his oxygen climbed and the windpipe at his throat settled back to center, and Eleanor said, to no one, to the part of herself that kept the records, needle decompression, right chest, 0519, the old reflex of noting the time, always noting the time, and Aidan Crail heard a night nurse call out a time of decompression like a woman reading from a book he had not known was real, and something in his face that had been forming all night finished forming. There was one more skeptic in the room, and Eleanor had felt him before she heard him, the way you feel a draft from an open door. A second physician had come up with the code overflow, a per diem hospitalist named Dr. Reston, mid-40s, competent and brusque and entirely unaware of anything that had happened before he walked in, and he had been standing at the periphery watching a gray-haired nurse run a resuscitation, and it had not sat well with him because it did not fit the order of things he carried in his head. He stepped in now in the small lull after the lung was decompressed, and he said, not cruelly, but with the flat authority of a man restoring what he believed was the proper chain of command, "Okay, I think we've got this stabilized. Let's let the physicians take it from here. Nurse, you've done great, but I want to slow down and reassess before we do anything else invasive." And there was a beat, a dangerous beat in which the room could have tipped backward, in which 3 exhausted residents who had just learned to trust this woman might have folded under the weight of a fresh attending certainty, and Eleanor knew that beat for exactly what it was, because she had lived it before, the moment a system tries to reassert itself over the person who actually understands the patient, and she did not get angry and she did not defer. She simply gave him the truth, fast and clean and impossible to argue with, the way she had once given it to senior officers across a litter. "Doctor, I'm glad you're here, and I'll hand off the second you're oriented, but do not slow down. This is a 26-year-old who arrested from a tamponade 9 minutes ago. We've got a partial drain and a sac that is going to refill, and he just tensioned his right lung from the resuscitation, and I've needled it, but that is a temporary fix, and it will come back. He is not stable. He is held. There is a difference, and the difference is about 4 minutes, and if we slow down to reassess from scratch, we will spend the 4 minutes we don't have. He needs the OR now, the call is already in, and what he needs from this room is for everybody to keep doing exactly what they're doing until transport arrives." And Dr. Reston, who had walked in ready to take command, looked at the patient and looked at the half-full syringe and the ultrasound image still up on the screen with its telltale black stripe, and looked at the calm, certain woman who had just laid out the entire picture more completely than he could have after 10 minutes of chart review, and he did the thing a genuinely competent person does when confronted with someone who knows more, which is that he yielded to the knowledge and not the title. He said, "Understood. What do you need from me?" And he stepped in beside her and became another pair of working hands, and the room did not tip, it held, and Eleanor kept the line. That was the part the protocols never quite capture, the part Aidan Crail would think about for the rest of his career, that the genius of what she did was not any single procedure. It was the continuous, ruthless management of the whole room, the patient and the people and the doubt all at once, the refusal to let either the body or the team slip, even for the few seconds it takes to lose both. She had a dying man and a healthy man's worth of complications stacking on top of each other, and a room full of people at 3 different levels of belief in her, and she ran all of it from one still point, with a voice that never rose, and she got it right, over and over, holding the line by inches, while the clock ran and the gray light had not yet thought about the windows. It was in the quiet after that second save, while they waited the last few minutes for the transport team, that the thing happened that Eleanor would not tell anyone about for a long time, because it happened only inside her. She was standing at the head of the bed, with one hand resting light on the young man's shoulder, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, the chest she had kept moving, and she was very tired, the deep tiredness that comes after, when the drawer she keeps everything in slides open a crack, and into that crack came a voice she had not heard in 20 years, clear as if the woman were standing right beside her in the bright room. It was Dow, Captain Dow Pham, who had been her partner in the back of the aircraft 3 decades and a lifetime ago, the sharp-mouthed, loving terror of a flight nurse who had taught Eleanor half of what her hands knew, who had drilled her on exactly this: the reversible killers, the things the machines miss, find them with your hands. Voss, the machine will lie to you, but the body never does. And Dow had not come home. She had died doing the work on a bad night Eleanor did not talk about, the night the scar on her arm came from, and afterward, among the things that found their way back, there had been a short letter Dow had written weeks before, the just-in-case kind they all wrote back then, to be opened only if, and Eleanor had opened it only if, and she knew it by heart, and one line of it rose up in her now, unbidden, the way the dead speak to us in their own stubborn words at the moments we need them most. They will tell you the new machines have made you old, Voss. Someday a room full of clever young people is going to look at you and decide you've got nothing left to teach them. Let them think it. And then the machines will lie, the way machines do, and you will be the only one left in the room who remembers how to find the truth with your hands, and you will save somebody's whole life, and they will never understand how an old woman knew what the screens could not tell them. That was the whole reason she had clipped that brass penlight to her lanyard every single shift for 36 years, while the residents smiled at the antique, not to be ready for herself, to be ready for them, for this room, this night, this stranger's son in the bed. Dow had been right. Dow had been right for 36 years, and Eleanor, with the dead woman's voice in her ear and the dead woman's lesson alive in her own 2 hands and in the trembling hands of a young doctor she had just taught to save a life, kept working and did not let herself cry. Not yet, because the crying was for later and the work was for now. The attending came through the door at 5:30 in the morning, the way attendings come, already moving, already scanning, a man named Dr. Walter Halverson, who had been called from home and had driven in fast with his coat thrown over scrubs, 63 years old, gray and unhurried in the particular way of a physician who has seen everything twice, and he was a man Eleanor had worked under for years without either of them ever quite having the conversation, because she did not start it, and he had been waiting, in his patient way, for her to. He came into a room that should have been a disaster and found instead a stabilized patient and an ordered team and a young man breathing on his own who by every rule should have been dead, and he took it in the way he took everything, with a long, slow look, and then he asked the question an attending asks, "Walk me through it," and it was Aidan Crail who answered, and the way Aidan Crail answered was its own kind of vindication, because the proud young man who 3 weeks ago could not have imagined deferring to a nurse stood there in front of the most senior physician in the building and said plainly, "Nurse Voss made the diagnosis. I missed it. She called it the moment she walked in and I didn't listen, and when he coded, she ran it. She found the tamponade clinically before we ever got the ultrasound on him, and she walked me through the pericardiocentesis, and then she caught a tension pneumo on top of it and walked me through the needle. I have never seen anything like it. He's alive because of her, not because of me, because of her." And Walter Halverson turned and looked at Eleanor Voss, really looked at her, and his eyes did a thing. They went to her left forearm, where the sleeve still sat pushed back from the work, to the faded tattoo and the scar, and then they went to the lanyard at her chest, to the worn brass penlight and the small pair of faded metal wings clipped beside it, and Eleanor watched him see the wings, watched him understand what they were, because Walter Halverson was old enough and had been around enough to know exactly what those wings meant and exactly what kind of person had earned them, and something moved across his weathered face, not surprise, more like the click of a long suspected thing finally confirmed, and he said quietly, in a voice meant mostly for her, the numbers from the tattoo, the unit, and then he said 3 words that were a question and were also already an answer. Nightingale, weren't you? And the room went still, because they did not understand the word, but they understood the weight of it, the way the old physician said it, like a name spoken in a church. And Eleanor Voss, who had let a whole floor call her slow and obsolete, and had not corrected one of them, looked at Walter Halverson, and for the first time in 20 years she said the call sign out loud, the one she had carried in silence under 3 months of their smiling condescension, and she said, "Nightingale, 2-2, a long time ago." And Halverson nodded slowly, and he did not salute her, because that is not how it works in a hospital at dawn. But he did something that landed just as hard in that room full of young people who had dismissed her. He straightened slightly, the way a man straightens in the presence of something he respects, and he said, loud enough now for all of them to hear, 2-2 ran the busiest evacuation rotation of its war. The survival numbers off those flights are still in the textbooks. They teach what your unit did to people like these 3 as the standard. I trained with people who trained under you and never knew it. He let that sit in the bright room for a moment, among the residents who had told her to stay in her lane, and then he said the thing that was the whole vindication of the night, not gloating, just true, just the recognition she had earned and been denied. "We are very lucky to have her on this floor. I'd suggest you all learn everything she's willing to teach you, because you will not get a better teacher, and you nearly didn't get the chance." It was not a salute, and it was not a slow clap, and there was no crowd cheering, because that is not how the real ones go. The real ones go quiet, and this one went exactly the way the true ones go. 4 sentences from one expert about another in a room at dawn, witnessed by the very people who had gotten her wrong, and Eleanor felt something go very quiet and very steady behind her eyes, the thing that had been waiting 36 years to be allowed to settle, and she did not weep, and she did not gloat, and she did not make a speech. She said, "We can talk about all that later. Right now, this young man needs to go upstairs." And the recognition, having landed, was set aside because the patient still came first and always would. But it had landed. It had landed on every person in that room, and not one of them, not Crail, not Bryce, not Priya, not the respiratory therapist who had watched the whole thing from the foot of the bed, would ever be able to unsee it again, the moment the slow old night nurse turned out to be a person their own textbooks were written about. The transport team arrived to take the young man to the operating room, and there is a particular way a handoff goes when the people taking over meet the people who have been holding the line, a dangerous seam in it where lives get lost in the translation if it is done badly, and Eleanor had been on both sides of that seam 10,000 times, and she made this one clean. She did not babble. She met the lead of the transport team and gave the report in the dense, ordered cadence that is its own password, the cadence you cannot fake, the one that tells another professional in 3 seconds that the person in front of you knows exactly what they are doing. 26-year-old male, witnessed PEA arrest secondary to cardiac tamponade, pericardiocentesis with good return at this time, then attention pneumothorax post-resuscitation needle decompressed on the right at 0519. Here are his pressures, here is what he's gotten, here is what he needs upstairs. And the transport lead's eyes came up off her clipboard and locked onto Eleanor the way the residents' eyes had, the recognition of a professional hearing another professional, and she said, "Copy all," the way you say it to a peer, and they moved the young man out the door and toward the elevator and toward the surgeon who would finish what a night nurse had started with a $50 penlight and her own 2 hands, and Aidan Crail walked alongside the bed to the elevator because he could not quite make himself let go of the patient he had nearly lost, and when the doors closed he stood there for a moment in the bright hallway, and then he walked back to the nurse's station where Eleanor was already, impossibly, beginning to chart, writing it out longhand in the paper backup the way she always did, and he stood in front of her not knowing how to begin, this young man who had always known how to begin. What Aidan Crail finally said was not smooth and it was not rehearsed, because some things are too big for the small machinery of an apology, and he had the grace, in the end, to know it. "I told you to stay in your lane," he said, looking at the counter and then making himself look at her, which cost him something. You could see it cost him. "You walked in and you told me exactly what it was, in plain English, and I didn't hear you because of who I thought you were. I had already decided. 3 weeks I'd been deciding, every time you wrote in that paper chart, every time you stood in a doorway and looked. I thought it was you being slow. It was you seeing things I couldn't see." He stopped. His jaw worked. He would have died. I would have run that code perfectly by the book, and he would have died on me, and I would never have known why. You knew before the monitor knew? I don't, I don't have the words for it. "I'm sorry, that's not enough, but I'm sorry." And Eleanor set down her pen, and she looked at this young man who had humiliated her in front of his juniors, and had then, when it mattered most, done the bravest thing a proud person can do, and let go of being right. And she did not make him stand in his shame, because she had never in her life taken pleasure in another person's smallness, and because cruelty was a luxury she had learned long ago she could not afford. What she gave him instead was the only thing that was both true and useful, which was the future. "You ran a clean code," she said. "Your compressions were good and your drugs were right, and when it counted you listened, and a lot of people with your training never learned to do that last part, so don't tell me you've got nothing. You've got plenty." She picked the pen back up, then set it down again, because this part mattered more than the chart. But hear the rest of it, because it's the only thing worth taking out of tonight. The monitor is not the patient. The number on the screen is not the patient. Those machines are wonderful, and they will save you 1,000 times, and then, on the worst night, when you need them most, one of them will tell you a comfortable lie, and the only thing that will catch it is your own eyes and your own hands on a real human body. That young man's rhythm looked perfect on the screen while he was dying, because the screen could only see the electrics, and the problem wasn't in the electrics. The body never lied. His neck veins never lied. You have to be willing to believe the patient over the picture. That is the whole job. That is the part they can't put in a guideline. And Aidan Crail, who had spent his whole life trusting the picture, nodded slowly, and something in him that had been hard and certain and a little bit closed quietly cracked open and began, maybe, to grow back in a better shape, and he said, "Will you teach me the clinical stuff, the exam, the way you read people? Will you teach me to do that?" And Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, the proud young man asking to be taught by the woman he had called an antique, and she said, "Yes, on nights, when it's quiet, bring the other two." And that was the recant, not a humiliation, not a man destroyed, just a man humbled into becoming a better one, and the story let him keep his dignity because he had earned the keeping of it in the hour he stopped being sure. The recalibration moved through the rest of the floor the way a current moves, person by person, over the hours and days that followed. Bryce, who had given the small, reflexive laugh when Crail told her to stay in her lane, came and found her at the end of that same shift and could barely get the words out, and what he said was, "I keep thinking about the fact that I laughed." He was about to die, and I laughed at the one person who knew. I'm not going to forget that. And Eleanor told him the thing she had learned a long time ago, that the value of a mistake is entirely in whether you let it change you, and that a doctor who never forgets the night he laughed at the wrong person will be a better doctor for it for 40 years. So carry it, but carry it forward, not as a weight, but as a compass. Priya, the sharp, quick young woman, did not say much at all, but she started doing a thing after that night. She started standing in doorways before she touched her patients, just looking, the way she had seen the old nurse do. And once, weeks later, she caught something early because of it. A patient going wrong before the monitor caught up, and she came and found Eleanor and said only, "I saw it before the screen did." And Eleanor said, "Good. Now you'll always look." And the two of them understood each other completely, and that was the whole of it, the knowledge passing down, which was the only monument Eleanor had ever wanted. Marisol Reyes found her in the break room near dawn, after when the floor had finally gone quiet, and the gray light was coming up in the tall windows, and she sat down across from Eleanor at the plain table and did not say anything for a while, just sat, two women who had worked side by side for 6 years, and then she said, soft, Nightingale 2-2. Not a question, just trying the weight of it, and Eleanor gave her a small, tired smile and said, "A long time ago?" The same 3 words, and Marisol shook her head slowly and said the thing she would say many times in the years that followed to anyone who would listen, because she had been there and she could not stop seeing it. 6 years. I worked next to you 6 years, and I knew there was something. I always knew there was something, but I had no idea. None of us did. And the part I can't get over, the part that scares me, is how sure those kids were, how sure we all are every day about people we've decided we already understand. We looked at you and we decided, and we were so wrong it should frighten every one of us, because how many of them are out there, the ones we've written off, carrying something we'll never see until the night we need it? And Eleanor looked out the window at the coming light and did not answer, because there was no answer. There was only the work and the people and the next necessary thing, and she was very tired, and somewhere upstairs a 26-year-old graduate student was waking up from surgery into the rest of a life he would get to have. And it was only then, alone for a moment while Marisol went to refill 2 cups of bad coffee, that Eleanor Voss let her hands do the thing they had wanted to do for an hour, which was to shake. Not in front of the patient, never in front of the patient, but here, after, in the quiet, the drawer she kept everything in slid all the way open, and the feeling she had paid forward came due, all at once, the fear she had not let herself feel, and the weight of how close it had been, and, underneath it, older and deeper, the night the scar came from, the night Dow did not come home, all of it rising up together the way it always did, after, when the work was done and there was finally room for it. Her hands shook, the way they had shaken 36 years ago in the back of an aircraft after a save, the body finally spending what the crisis had not allowed it to spend, and she sat with it and breathed the way she had taught 100 younger nurses to breathe, slow, all the way down, and waited for the worst country to recede. And Marisol came back with the coffee and saw and did not say anything at all, just set the cup down and sat close, shoulder to shoulder, and after a while reached over and put her own steady hand over Eleanor's shaking ones and held them still the way you hold something precious. 2 underpaid women on a night shift who had just pulled a young man back from the dead with their bare hands and an old brass light, and that was when Eleanor remembered the letter and let herself, for the first time in 20 years, really think about Dow. There was a letter that lived folded in a worn envelope at the bottom of a box on Eleanor's dresser at home. The box where the meaning of the tattoo in the wings was kept in paper, and she had not needed to read it in years because she knew it by heart, but she thought of it now, in the gray dawn light, with Marisol's hand over her own. The penlight had not always been only hers, not really. She had bought it, yes, that first week near the base, but it was Dao Pham who had taught her what to do with it. Dao, who had grabbed her wrist the first time Eleanor reached for a monitor in the shaking dark of the cabin and said, sharp over the rotors, the machine can't see his pupils, Voss. Your light can. Use your light. And from that night on, the cheap brass thing had become the most important instrument Eleanor owned, because Dao had shown her that it told the one truth no screen could. Dao had been a few years older, a captain to Eleanor's lieutenant, a small, fierce woman from a coastal town with a mouth like a blade and a heart she hid badly, and she had taught Eleanor the whole brutal art of it, the triage of attention, the reversible killers, the discipline to be guided by the cold arithmetic and not the loudest scream. And she had taught her, above all, the thing that had saved Daniel Okafor 36 years later, that on the worst night, when everything fails, the body never lies. And then one night, Dow had not come home. It was a bad night, the worst, the night the scar on Eleanor's arm came from, and Eleanor did not talk about it, not ever, not to her husband and not to Marisol and not to anyone. She only carried it, the way she carried all of them. And among the things that found their way back afterward, there had been the wings, Dow's own flight wings, and a short letter Dow had written weeks before, the just-in-case letter addressed to Eleanor in Dow's slashing, impatient hand, to be opened only if, and Eleanor had opened it only if. The letter did not say the things you would expect. It did not say be brave or live well or any of the things people put on cards. Dow had written in that hard, fast hand just a few lines, and the lines that mattered, the ones Eleanor had carried for 36 years along with the wings and the light, were these. They will tell you the new machines have made you old, Voss. Someday a room full of clever young people is going to look at you and decide you've got nothing left to teach them, that what we know is out of date, that we are out of date. Let them think it. Don't waste your breath. And then one night, the machines will lie, the way machines always do at the worst possible moment, and you will be the only one left in that room who remembers how to find the truth with your hands, and you will save somebody's whole life, and they will never understand how an old woman knew what all their screens could not tell them. That is the secret. That is the whole secret of what we do. We don't do it to be thanked, because we won't be, not really, not in any way that lasts. We do it so that on the worst night, somebody in the room knows what to do. Keep the light on your chest. You'll know the night you need it. And Eleanor had kept the light on her chest, every shift, for 36 years, not as a keepsake, but as a readiness, a quiet promise to a dead friend that she would not let them make her forget what her hands knew. No matter how many residents smiled at the antique, no matter how many of them told her to stay in her lane. And that night, on a cardiac floor at 5 in the morning, the night had come, exactly as Dow had said it would. The room had forgotten everything they both knew, and Eleanor had been the only one left who remembered, and she had saved him. And not one of them had understood how an old woman knew. Dow had been right about all of it. She had been right for 36 years. And sitting at that plain table with the coffee going cold and Marisol's hand steadying her own, Eleanor Voss, 58 years old, finally let herself cry, quietly for the friend who had known, and for the strange long road that had carried her from the back of an aircraft to a checkout of bad coffee in a break room at dawn. And Marisol held her hands and let her, and out past the window the ordinary world came up bright and indifferent and full of people who would get to keep their mourning because of what those hands had done. They tried, in the days that came after, to make a thing of her, because that is what the world does now. Somebody had talked, the way somebody always does, and the story got around the hospital and then past it. The gray-haired night nurse, who turned out to be a decorated combat flight nurse, who diagnosed a tamponade by hand and talked a resident through saving a life. And there was the kind of attention that comes, the hospital's own communications office wanting to feature her, a local reporter who had gotten hold of the call sign and the unit and wanted the whole story, the war and all of it, the headline already written in their heads, hero, miracle. And Eleanor gave them almost nothing because she had never done any of it to be seen, and she was not going to start now. She let them say she was a retired flight nurse. She let the rest stay in the box where it belonged, the night she did not talk about, the friend she had lost, the scar. When the reporter asked her how she had known what to do, she said only that she had had good teachers, and she meant Tao, and she did not explain. When they asked her how it felt to be called a hero, she said she did not think she was one, that a hero was a word for someone who does something nobody expects, and that she had only done the thing she had been trained for 36 years to do, the thing she had promised someone she would always be ready to do. And when they pushed, the way they do, for the emotional line, the triumphant line, she gave them the only thing she had, which did not fit their story at all. She said the real lesson of that night was not that one old nurse remembered, it was that a whole floor of brilliant, decent, hard-working young people had been allowed to forget, to believe the screen so completely that they nearly missed a death in front of their eyes, and that the danger was not in any one of them. It was in the whole machine that taught them to trust the picture over the person, and that if her story was good for anything, it was as a warning, not a fairy tale. Nobody quite knew what to do with that answer. It did not make a headline, so they ran the headline anyway, hero, miracle, and Eleanor let them and went back to work the next night because the patients did not care about headlines and neither did she. The ones who came to find her were not the reporters, they were the others. Daniel Okafor's mother came first, a quiet woman who had flown in from 2 states away while her son was in surgery, and she came up to the cardiac floor on a night she knew Eleanor would be working. And she did not really know what to say, and so she just took both of Eleanor's hands in both of hers and held them. The hands that had kept her son in the world, and she wept, and Eleanor stood and let her, because she knew that for this woman it had not been a shift. It had been the line between the rest of her life and the end of it, and to wave that off would have been a cruelty. And weeks later Daniel himself came, walking on his own, thinner and a little careful, with his chest but alive, entirely alive, a young man with the whole long arc of a life still in front of him, and he did not know how to thank the woman who had given it back to him. And so he did not try with words. He just asked shyly if he could sit with her for a few minutes on her break, and they sat, and he told her about the graduate program he was going back to, the research he wanted to do, the ordinary enormous future that would not have existed, and Eleanor listened, and that was the thanks, the listening, the proof sitting right there in a chair telling her about his life. And she received each of them with the same quiet she received everything, and she never once said she had only done her job, because she had learned that to say that to the people whose lives you have saved is its own small cruelty, a way of refusing them the gift of mattering to you, and so she let it matter, which was the hardest thing of all for a woman who had spent her whole life deflecting. And the cost was real, and she did not hide it from herself, because she never had. There were nights the old country came back, the shaking dark of the cabin, the night she did not talk about, and she would wake with her hands already moving, already reaching for a light that was not clipped to her chest in the dark of her bedroom, and she would lie still and breathe the way she had taught 100 younger nurses to breathe and wait for it to recede. She carried Tao still and always would, one more face on the long roll she carried, and on the bad nights she did the old useless after-the-fact math, the math that has no answer, and the honest answer, the answer Tao herself would have given her flat across the cabin, was that some nights you save them and some nights you do not, and the difference is not always anything you did, and that the saves are why you carry the rest. That was the deal she had made long ago and made again now. You carry them. You do not get to set them down. And you keep your hands ready anyway, and you keep the light on your chest, because the next night might be a save, and the saves are the whole reason. Because she did go back. That surprised people too. She did not take the offers that came after, the speaking invitations, the daytime education job the hospital suddenly found it could fund, the chance to be admired from a distance behind a desk. She put her scrubs back on and went back to the night shift on the same cardiac floor, slow and deliberate, charting in cursive in the paper backup the way she always had, because the work was still the work, and a patient at 3 in the morning still did not care how old her shoes were. But the floor was different around her now, the way a place is different after it has watched a person become who they really are. The residents rotated the way residents do, but Aidan Crail stayed through the rest of his year on nights and asked for her shifts, and on the quiet stretches between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the floor was settled and the call lights were silent, she taught him, the way Dow had taught her. She taught him to stand in a doorway and read a patient before he touched a thing. She taught him the reversible killers, the things the machines miss, the ones you have to rule out with your own hands, and she made him say them back to her until they were reflex, the way Dow had drilled her, so that on his own worst night, years from now, in some other room, they would be waiting in him, loaded, ready. She taught him to believe the patient over the picture, and he learned because the night he nearly killed a man by trusting the screen had burned something open in him that stayed open, and he became, in time, the kind of doctor who would himself one day stand in a noisy room and catch the thing everyone else was missing and teach a frightened younger person how to see it and never quite know that he was passing down, hand to hand, a thing that had come to him from a small, fierce woman who died in the back of an aircraft before he was born. That was the thing, more than any headline, that made Eleanor feel the night had been worth its terrible price, that the knowledge had found someone younger to live in, that it would outlast her now, the way Dow's had outlasted Dow, passed down a long, quiet line of ordinary people who would each, on some worse night, be the only one in the room who knew what to do. There is a thing that happens on that floor now, in the last hour of a night shift, when the gray light begins to come up in the tall windows at the end of the hall and the ward goes quiet and the day team has not yet arrived. A held, peaceful hour that belongs to the people who worked the dark. Eleanor finishes her charting. She closes the paper back up, and before she clocks out every single shift, she does one small thing that no one but Marisol and now Aidan Crail understands, and they understand it completely, and they never say a word about it. She reaches up and unclips the worn brass penlight from her lanyard, the antique, the cheap brass thing a younger man once smiled at, the light that was the first instrument Dow ever taught her to trust, and the last thing of Dow's she has left beside the wings, and she turns it once in her lined hands, gently, the way you greet an old friend, and she thumbs it on and off once to check the small, steady beam, the way she has checked it 10,000 times, and then she clips it back to her chest where it lives, ready for the next ordinary night that might not stay ordinary, and she clocks out and she goes home, an old woman who works nights, carrying on her chest the entire reason a young man got to grow old. Because that is the thing the world keeps getting wrong, the thing it got wrong about Eleanor Voss on the night shift and gets wrong every single day about the quiet, competent people it has decided are finished. Valor does not retire. It does not show up on a screen, and it does not announce itself, and it will let you call it slow and old and behind the times for as long as you need to, and it will keep charting your patients and checking your monitors and waiting, patient as a stone, on the chest of someone you walked right past until the night the machines lie and the room finally needs it. The clever young people will trust the picture because the picture is almost always right, and on the night it is wrong, on the one night in 1,000 it tells its comfortable lie, the whole room will turn, without deciding to, toward the one steady voice that is not afraid, the one pair of old hands that knows how to find the truth without the picture, and they will live because of it, and most of them will never understand how she knew. She does not need them to understand. She only needs to be there, on the worst night, ready, the light on her chest. That was the promise. That is the whole secret. So here is what I will leave you with, the question I have been turning over since I first heard this story, and I would truly like to know how you land on it, because I do not think there is an easy answer. The next time you are in a room full of credentials and confidence, full of the people the system has lifted up and the machines everyone has learned to trust, and something begins, quietly, to go wrong, who are you going to be? Are you going to be one of the ones who keeps watching the screen, who trusts the picture and the protocol and the person with the loudest title right up until the moment it fails? Or are you going to be the one who looks for the quiet, competent soul in the corner, the one nobody else is listening to, the slow old hand with the worn brass light, and asks her what she sees, and learns, the way 3 brilliant young doctors learned on a cardiac floor before the sun came up, that the most important person in the room is almost never the one the room has decided it is. That was tonight's story from Unspoken Valor. Some heroes never ask to be seen, but they're always worth the salute.